I am Eva Collins, and 2 weeks ago, I believe my life was finally falling into place. I had a ring on my finger, a white dress hanging in the closet, and a date circled in red on the calendar. After years of double shifts at the hospital, student loans, and saving every dollar I could, I was ready to start a new chapter with a man I thought loved me. His name was Daniel. We had planned to marry in Boston, with only a handful of friends and family to witness it. Nothing grand, just a promise sealed in a quiet room with vows whispered before God. I thought that would be enough. But on the night before the wedding, my phone lit up with a single message from Daniel. "I can't do this." That was all. No explanation. No face-to-face conversation. Just 10 characters on a glowing screen. I stared at those words until the letters blurred, and my heart clenched like it had been nailed shut. I called, texted, begged him to talk. He never replied. Silence became his final answer. The next morning, I packed the dress into a thrift store bag and left our tiny apartment. The rent was overdue, and the cupboards were half empty. When I checked my balance, I saw only $423 in my account, barely enough to last a week in the city. I didn't have the luxury of mourning or falling apart. I needed to survive. So I took the first job that promised a roof over my head and enough money to start over, a live-in nurse position with a paralyzed billionaire named Alexander Pierce. The agency told me the pay was $3,000 a week, plus a private room in his house in Newport, Rhode Island. I didn't ask questions. I just said yes. The drive to Newport felt like crossing into another world. The city lights of Boston gave way to open stretches of road, the ocean occasionally glinting in the distance like a secret waiting to be revealed. When I finally turned onto Harbor Lane, the house appeared before me, and for a moment, I forgot to breathe. The mansion looked like a ship stranded on land, its white shingles gleaming, tall windows catching the last rays of the sun. The Atlantic wind pressed against the glass panes, rattling them faintly. Stone steps led up to a wide porch, and above it, a balcony stretched like the deck of a vessel overlooking the restless sea. Even from the driveway, I felt the weight of the house's silence, as though it had witnessed too many stories and was waiting to see if I would add mine. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and lemons. The entrance hall was wide and high-ceilinged, with polished floors that reflected the chandelier's soft glow. A grand piano stood in the adjoining room, its lid closed, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. Portraits lined the walls, stern men in suits, women in gowns, all watching me with eyes painted centuries ago. I tightened my grip on my bag and reminded myself, I was here to work, not to gawk. A woman in a gray sweater appeared at the end of the hall. Her brown hair was tied back neatly, and her posture carried the kind of quiet authority you couldn't ignore. "You must be Eva Collins," she said, her voice kind but cautious. "I'm Grace Turner, the household manager. Mr. Pierce is upstairs." She led me up the winding staircase, her steps brisk but silent. The house seemed too large for only a handful of residents. I imagined echoes filling the empty rooms, bouncing off the walls like trapped whispers. On the third floor, Grace showed me my quarters, a modest room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a small window that overlooked the ocean. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I placed my bag on the bed and, without thinking, slipped my wedding dress beneath the mattress, hiding it like a secret I couldn't yet throw away. By dusk, Grace knocked on my door. "Mr. Pierce keeps late hours," she explained. "If he needs water or medication, you'll hear the bell. Tonight, you can make the first check." She handed me a tray with a glass of water and a pillbox. My palms sweated against the metal surface as I carried it down the long, shadowed corridor. Mr. Pierce's door was open. He sat in a sleek, modern wheelchair by the window, the fading light painting his silver hair in pale gold. His jaw was sharp, his shoulders straight, though I knew from his file that he could no longer walk. Wealth showed itself in small ways. The soft wool blanket draped over his legs, the framed ticket to a charity gala in New York, and the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than my nursing degree. On the table beside him stood a photo in a heavy silver frame. My eyes locked onto it instantly, and my breath caught in my throat. The woman in the picture wore a simple blue dress. Her smile was bright, her eyes full of warmth, and behind her stretched a lake I knew all too well. The tray trembled in my hands. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Sir," I whispered, my voice breaking, "where did you get that picture?" Mr. Pierce turned his chair slowly, his gray eyes sharp but alive with something I couldn't place. He lifted the frame as if it were the most precious thing he owned. "It's the only one that matters," he said quietly. Her name was Mary Collins. The words crashed through me like a tidal wave. My knees weakened, and the tray rattled louder. "That's my mother," I managed to say. "That is my mother." For a moment, the world stopped. The ticking of his watch filled the silence, loud and insistent, like a church bell in an empty street. He looked from the photo to my face, his expression shifting, softening, and then hardening again. His lips parted, and in a voice heavy with disbelief and something deeper, regret, maybe, he spoke the words that shattered the fragile ground beneath me. "Eva," he said, his voice low but clear, "you are my daughter." The tray slid from my hands. A glass tumbled, shattered against the floor, water spreading like a wound across the polished wood. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, my entire life breaking open in front of me. And in that moment, the house on Harbor Lane no longer felt like just another place of work. It felt like the stage of a truth I was never meant to hear. Grace rushed in when she heard the crash of glass, her eyes wide with alarm. But before she could speak, Mr. Pierce lifted his hand, his voice calm and firm. "We're fine," he said, though my heart was anything but fine. His gray eyes never left mine, and his expression carried the weight of something far deeper than a broken glass. Grace hesitated for a moment, glanced at me with quiet concern, then closed the door softly behind her, leaving the two of us alone in the heavy silence. I felt frozen, pinned in place by the storm of emotions inside me. Anger, disbelief, grief, all tangled together. The idea that this man, a stranger I had known for less than an hour, could look at me and call me his daughter seemed impossible, absurd. And yet, the photo on his desk told a different story. My mother's face smiled back at me from inside the frame, her eyes bright, her laughter caught forever in that single moment. He set the photo down carefully, as though it might shatter if he breathed too hard. "Your mother and I met in Chicago," he began, his voice steady but threaded with regret. "I was a young investor then, full of ambition, too proud for my own good. She was everything, kind, brilliant, and beautiful in ways that went far beyond the surface. We were together for nearly a year." He paused, looking past me as if replaying scenes only he could see. "Then came a deal in London. I told myself I'd be gone only a few months, that I'd come back. But I never did. It was cowardice. Nothing more." I sank into the nearest chair, my body numb. My mother had never spoken his name. She had always told me the past was a locked room, and I had learned never to knock on that door. She had raised me with quiet strength, working nights in a small clinic, saving what little we had in a jar, she called someday. We had good years filled with laughter, and we had hard ones where every dollar mattered. She carried it all alone, and now here sat the man who should have carried it with her. "She never told me about you," I whispered, my throat tight. "She said some things were better left behind." He closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to his temples. "I tried to find her," he said, "but too late. By the time I traced her, she was gone." His voice broke on the word gone, and for the first time, I saw not a powerful billionaire, but an old man haunted by regret. I told myself I would honor her in whatever way I could. I gave $5 million to a nursing foundation in her name. Scholarships, research grants. "But money," he gave a hollow laugh. "Money is a poor apology." His words twisted something deep inside me. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that $5 million could never put food back on our table or fix the wobbling leg of our kitchen chair. That no amount of wealth could buy back the nights my mother came home exhausted, her hands raw, her smile still brave. But when I looked at his shaking hands, I swallowed the words. The file from the agency had mentioned his accident. A rain-slick road outside Providence, a guardrail, a car that spun out of control. 2 years ago his spine had been severed, and from that moment his life had been divided in two, before and after. Why me? I finally asked. My voice sounded sharper than I meant. Why hire me? Did you already know? He shook his head.
I didn't, he said.
Grace handled the agency. I only saw the roster this afternoon. When I saw your name, Eva Collins, it stirred something I couldn't explain. And when you walked in, Mary's eyes were staring back at me from your face. I knew before you even spoke. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I wanted proof, something beyond his word, and a photograph. He seemed to understand. He pressed a button on his chair, summoning Grace back. Bring me the folder, he told her. She returned with a manila envelope, her gaze curious but careful, and handed it to him. He opened it and slid a document across the table. It was my birth certificate. My mother's handwriting marked the lines, her careful letters spelling out Eva Mary Collins. My middle name, Mary. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. He placed a checkbook beside it, his pen poised as if money might soften the truth. Don't, I snapped, pushing it away. Don't try to fix this with a check. You can't. He lowered the pen slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. You're right. Then give me tasks, he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were pleading. Tell me how to earn a place in your life. If there is any way at all. The room fell silent. Outside, the sea pounded against the rocks, steady and relentless, like the beating of a giant heart. A gull cried somewhere in the distance. I thought of Boston, of the wedding dress hidden under my mattress, of Daniel's empty chair at the registry office. I thought of my mother humming softly while she scrubbed dishes, of coins clinking into the someday jar. She had carried hope in her hands, and now here I was, face to face with the man who had broken hers. Someday is today, I said finally, surprising myself with the words. Start by telling me everything. The whole story. Don't leave anything out. And he did. Through the night, he talked. He spoke of deals that made him rich and deals that nearly ruined him. Of flights across Europe, of an empty house in Newport that he filled with art because people applauded it. He spoke of Grace, the woman who had managed his home for years, who had stood by him after the accident when he wanted nothing more than to give up. He told me he had once had a son, a boy who died young, a wound that never healed. He confessed that losing his legs had taken only his movement, but losing love had stolen his voice. I listened, not sure whether to believe him, not sure whether to hate him or forgive him. But as the hours passed, the lines on his face seemed to soften, the armor of wealth and pride slipping away. He was no longer the untouchable billionaire in the wheelchair. He was just a man who had made mistakes, who had loved and lost, who now looked at me with a longing he could not disguise. Before dawn, I rose and set his pills on the tray. He looked exhausted, but there was a strange lightness in him, as though speaking had lifted a burden he had carried for decades. Eva, he said softly, stay in this house as long as you wish. Not as staff, as my daughter. He hesitated, his voice trembling. But I will accept the role you give me. I stood there, holding the tray, my mind racing. I thought of rent, of the contract with the agency, of practical things that tethered me to the life I had always known. I thought of how easily words could be spoken, how fragile they were compared to years of silence. We'll see, I said at last, because they were the only words I trusted. The days began to settle into a rhythm, though at first it felt fragile, like walking on thin ice. I woke early, not out of obligation but out of habit. Years of nursing shifts had trained my body to stir before dawn. I would brew coffee in the quiet kitchen, its tiles cool beneath my feet, and carry a mug into the sunroom where the ocean was always visible through wide panes of glass. Sometimes Alexander was already there, a blanket draped across his lap, staring at the horizon as though searching for answers in the restless water. I performed my duties with care, Wound checks, range of motion stretches, medication schedules, careful transfers from chair to bed and back again. It was work I knew well, but here it carried an odd weight, because every time my hand steadied his arm or adjusted the blanket, I was reminded that this man was not just a patient.
He was blood.
My blood. And though I had not chosen him, nor he me, the bond hummed between us like a taut string, impossible to ignore. Over breakfast, conversation began to flow. He told me stories of New York in the 80s, of skyscrapers half-finished and men with too much ambition crowding into smoky bars. He spoke of his first office, a dingy space above a laundromat where the pipes leaked and the paint peeled, but where every contract signed felt like gold. I shared smaller stories. My nursing program in Philadelphia, the professor who said I had steady hands and a stubborn heart, the way my mother would leave notes in my lunchbox even in college, as though I were still a child in need of courage. We moved cautiously, both of us. I kept my room on the 3rd floor, and I continued to take my wages. He didn't press me to accept more, though I could see the longing in his eyes. Instead, he offered small, human gestures. Once, when I broke down in the laundry room, overwhelmed by everything, the failed wedding, the revelation of his fatherhood, the sheer weight of grief, he didn't intrude. He simply waited outside the door until I emerged, blotchy-faced and embarrassed. He said nothing, only offered me a glass of water, and that silence was worth more than any speech. He asked about my mother's favorite song one evening, and when I told him she used to hum, "Let It Be," while cooking, he closed the piano in the parlor and left it untouched. "When you're ready," he said softly. He didn't need to say more. The gesture was enough. Visitors began to arrive. Some came out of genuine concern, others with motives hidden beneath polished smiles. I learned their names and their habits. Michael Stone, a sharp-eyed board member, always brought folders and figures, talking in clipped tones about investments and dividends. Linda Alvarez, his attorney, had a warmth that softened the air. She greeted me as though she had known me longer than a week. And then there was the cousin, Catherine Pierce, who swept in wearing pearls and perfume, her smile too wide, her questions too sharp. "So you're the nurse," Catherine said, her voice sugar-laced with knives. "How lovely. Do you plan to stay here forever? You know how these stories go, don't you? Nurses become heiresses." She let the words hang in the air like poison. I didn't answer. I only carried the tray of tea back to the kitchen and let the silence speak for me. Later, I asked Grace about her. Grace sighed, her hands steady as she folded linens. "Some people spend their lives counting money that isn't theirs," she said. "Let them waste their time. I believe in what's real." She gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze, and I realized then that Grace had become more than a housekeeper to me. She was an anchor. Still, the subject of money could not be avoided. One morning I found a folder placed neatly on my desk. Inside was a letter in Alexander's handwriting, "For your work and your future." My agency contract had been terminated with grace and respect, and in its place was a new offer. Private nurse to A. Pierce, for $1,500 a week, room and board, renewable monthly. He had signed it himself, and in the margin added a line, "If you choose a different path, I will still help, no strings." There was also a second envelope from Linda. Inside lay legal documents establishing a trust in my name, £10,000 to be deposited immediately, earmarked for the clearing of my student loans. The letter stated it was a gift from Alexander's personal account, with no conditions attached. My throat tightened. It felt too much, too fast. I marched into his study, the papers clutched in my hand. "This feels like buying me," I said, the words spilling out harsher than I intended. He looked at me calmly, almost with sadness. "It's not buying you, Eva. It is me undoing a knot I tied years ago. If you want me only as your patient, I will accept that and be grateful. But if you want me as your father, then I must act like one, and fathers remove weights from their children's shoulders." His words struck me like a bell. I wanted to protest, to tell him he hadn't earned the right to call himself my father. But part of me understood. My mother had carried the weight alone. Perhaps he was trying, in his flawed way, to carry a piece of it now. I stood there, torn between anger and a strange, reluctant gratitude. Finally I spoke. "I will take the job," I said. "But not the trust. Not yet." He nodded once, his eyes glinting with quiet pride, as though my refusal meant more to him than my acceptance ever could. That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. The house shuddered as wind battered the windows and rain lashed the glass. I moved from room to room, checking latches and curtains, the old wood groaning under the weight of the gale. When I reached his chamber, I found him awake, the photo of my mother in his lap. She laughed with her whole face, he murmured, gazing at the picture as though it might come alive. "And you do too, Eva, when you forget to be brave." I sank down onto the rug, exhausted. "I am tired of being brave," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the storm. We sat there together, listening to the rain beat its fists against the house, the thunder rolling like distant drums. And for the first time since I had stepped through the doors of Harbor Lane, I felt the house wasn't just a place of work or a cage of secrets. It felt like a hand, holding us both in its palm, steadying us against the storm. A week after the storm, my phone rang. The name on the screen nearly stopped my heart. Daniel. For a moment I considered letting it buzz itself silent, but curiosity and a faint trace of old loyalty made me swipe to answer. His voice was thin, like someone calling from a tunnel.
He said he missed me.
He said he'd been scared of marriage, scared of the responsibility, scared that I would ask him for money when things got hard. He tried to laugh, tried to sound like the man I had once trusted. But all I felt was distance, a chasm I no longer wanted to cross. "I don't need a man with money," I told him. "I need a man with a backbone." The words came without hesitation, and as soon as I spoke them, I knew they were true. I hung up before he could respond. My hands trembled, but my chest felt lighter, as though I had set down a heavy bag I didn't know I was still carrying. When I returned to the house, I found Alexander in the gym with his physical therapist, a steady man named Drew who had a voice as calm as still water. They were working through stretching exercises, Alexander pushing his arms against the resistance bands with surprising determination. Sweat gleamed on his forehead, and for the first time, I saw not just survival in him, but hunger, a will to live. After Drew left, Alexander sat by the wide window, staring at the sea. "I want to try," he said, his voice firm. "Not just to walk again, I know the odds, but to live better, to be more than I have been." He turned to me, eyes bright. "Let's make a list. Something to follow. Something real." So we sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad between us. I held the pen and he dictated. "Learn to cook one meal together each week. Write Mary a letter and read it aloud. Visit Boston and stand outside the registry office, not in sorrow, but in thanks. Invite people who feel like home, not noise. Play the piano again when we are ready. Say what we mean even when it shakes." Grace found the list later and pinned it to the corkboard with a smile. "Finally," she said, "a plan I like." Her approval gave the house a new kind of warmth, like sunlight creeping into corners long kept dark. That Sunday, we began with pasta. The kitchen smelled of garlic and olive oil, though we overdid both. Alexander chopped tomatoes with awkward slowness, his hands trembling, while I stirred the pot. We spilled sauce on the counter, burnt the first batch of noodles, and laughed through it all. It was not about the food, it was about the doing, about creating something together instead of sitting apart. On Tuesday, we wrote our letters. I spread fresh paper on the table, and for a long time, neither of us moved. Finally, he picked up the pen. His hand shook, but the words poured out. "Mary, I found our girl. She found me back. I am sorry for all the years I lost, but I am here now, trying to be the man you once believed I could be." When it was my turn, my throat tightened. "Mom, I am in a house by the sea in America. The windows are wide, the air smells of salt, and I am okay. I am learning how to live without the ache of what could have been. I think you would be proud." We read our letters aloud in the parlor, voices breaking, and when we finished, The silence between us was softer, kinder. The next week, we drove to Boston. I stood outside the registry office where I would have become a wife, and for the first time, I felt no bitterness. I breathed in the city air, full of car horns and roasted coffee, and I let the past loosen its grip. We ate hot dogs from a cart and shared a soda that fizzed against our teeth. It felt like a small holiday, like proof that joy could be found in ordinary places. Back in Newport, I found myself drawn to the piano. My mother had taught me to play when I was young, her hands guiding mine across the keys. The instrument had sat silent since my arrival, waiting. That evening, I lifted the lid. Alexander rolled beside me, his eyes steady. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," I whispered, though my fingers trembled. I pressed the first notes of Let It Be, the song my mother loved most. The melody filled the room, shaky at first, then stronger as memory carried me. Alexander reached forward, pressing the sustain pedal with his hand, a clever adaptation Drew had taught him. The chords swelled, rich and full, and for a moment, it felt as though my mother was there with us, listening. The house seemed to breathe, the walls holding the music like a secret too precious to lose. Later, we sat together on the porch, the ocean stretching endless and dark before us. The air was cool, the stars faint through thin clouds. Alexander turned to me, his expression solemn. "The trust is still there," he said quietly. "It will wait until you are ready. If you never want it, then it will become a fund for nurses who need a hand. Either way, it is love, not payment." I looked at him, at the man who had once been a stranger, who was now something else, something I could not yet name but no longer denied. "We will decide together," I said. Simple words, but true ones. In that moment, I understood. I was still Eva. I was still a nurse. I was still a daughter. The house on Harbor Lane now knew my steps, and I no longer froze when the wind rattled its old windows. I moved, I breathed, I counted what was real, the sea, the music, the list on the wall, the names of those who stayed, Grace, Drew, Linda, and Alexander, who had learned how to say I'm sorry and I'm here. This is my story. Told in easy words, in America, with money that can help but cannot heal, with a house that waited patiently for me to arrive, and with a door that finally opened. Europe is far away tonight. The ocean is close. And I am home.